They called him the Monster, and in a sport built on toughness, Kevin Randleman redefined what that meant. With a chiseled physique that looked carved from stone and athleticism that seemed almost superhuman, he could slam you through the canvas or end your night with one explosive punch. But Kevin's story wasn't just about raw power. It was about fighting his way out of a rough upbringing in Sandusky, Ohio, becoming a two-time NCAA wrestling champion, and then taking that tenacity into the UFC and Pride rings. He battled legends, shocked the world with one of the most iconic suplexes in MMA history, and left behind a legacy as one of the sport's most respected and feared pioneers. Yet, behind the muscles and highlight reels was a man who faced battles far tougher than any opponent. This is the story of Kevin Randleman, the Monster. Kevin Christopher Randleman was born on August 10, 1971, in Sandusky, Ohio, a small Midwestern city with blue-collar grit, but few opportunities for a young black kid trying to find his place in the world. He was the middle of 11 children, growing up in a crowded house where competition wasn't just encouraged, it was survival. Life in Sandusky meant learning to be tough early. The streets could be unforgiving, and Kevin had to navigate an environment where trouble was always around the corner. School was a challenge, too. By his own admission, Randleman wasn't the best student, but what he lacked in academics, he more than made up for in raw physical ability. Even before wrestling found him, he was known in his neighborhood for being impossibly strong and lightning fast. Fights happened, as they often did for kids in his position, but Kevin's natural competitiveness set him apart. It was wrestling that gave him direction. At Sandusky High School, Kevin walked into the wrestling room and found an outlet that matched his personality. Aggressive, physical, and demanding of discipline. The sport came naturally to him. He was explosive, fearless, and had a gas tank that seemed bottomless. Coaches recognized that if Kevin could focus, he had the tools to be special. By his junior year, he was a force in Ohio high school wrestling, collecting wins over more experienced opponents with a combination of brute power and athleticism they simply couldn't match. He wasn't just winning, he was dominating, and doing it with a style that made people stop and watch. But wrestling didn't just keep him busy, it kept him out of trouble. The discipline of training, the structure of practice, and the mentorship from coaches gave Kevin a lifeline away from the street life that had claimed so many of his peers. He began to dream bigger, not just about being the best wrestler in the state, but about using the sport as a ticket to a better life. For Randleman, wrestling was more than a sport, it was salvation. And as he graduated high school, his sights were set on the next level, one of the most prestigious wrestling programs in the country. When Kevin Randleman arrived at Ohio State University, he stepped into a room filled with elite-level talent. But it didn't take long for him to stand out. His physique was already something that turned heads, even among other collegiate athletes. He was lean, muscular, and built like a sprinter, yet he could wrestle at a relentless pace that few could endure. From the start, he showed he wasn't intimidated by the spotlight. In 1991, as a freshman, he began racking up wins against more seasoned opponents, but it was his sophomore year that would cement his place as a Buckeye legend. In 1992, Randleman won his first NCAA Division I championship at 177 pounds, dominating the field with a combination of speed and raw power that made him nearly impossible to counter. He followed it up in 1993 with a second NCAA title, proving it wasn't just a one-time run. What set Kevin apart wasn't just his wrestling skill, it was his mentality. He wrestled with controlled chaos, always pressing forward, never giving his opponents a moment to breathe. He turned matches into sprints, and if you couldn't match his pace, he'd overwhelm you before you even had a chance to adjust. By his senior year, Randleman was already being talked about as one of the most explosive wrestlers in NCAA history. He made 3 NCAA finals in 4 years, finishing with 2 national titles and a runner-up. Alongside teammate and mentor Mark Coleman, Kevin helped elevate Ohio State wrestling's national profile. Those years also shaped his competitive mindset. In wrestling, there's nowhere to hide, no teammates to cover for mistakes. It's just you and the other man. And Kevin thrived under that pressure. He developed a mental toughness that would later define his MMA career, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between victory and defeat. By the time he left Ohio State in 1993, Kevin had the credentials, the discipline, and the physical gifts to excel in whatever he chose next. But he didn't yet know that his future would be in a brand new sport that was just starting to explode: mixed martial arts. In the mid-1990s, MMA was still raw, still dangerous, still trying to figure out exactly what it was. Back then, the UFC was more underground spectacle than polished sport, and Japan's veiled Tudo scene was as brutal as it got. When Kevin Randleman decided to enter the fight game, he was stepping into a world far less regulated and far more unforgiving than anything wrestling had prepared him for. His entry point came through his Ohio State teammate and friend, Mark Coleman. Coleman, the godfather of ground and pound, had already made a name for himself as a UFC champion and was building a team, Hammer House, that specialized in turning wrestlers into MMA wrecking machines. Coleman saw in Kevin a younger version of himself, raw, explosive, and mean enough to succeed in a cage. Randleman began training MMA seriously in 1996, and it didn't take long for him to adapt. His wrestling base gave him immediate control over fights, allowing him to dictate where the action took place. But what surprised people was his striking power. Kevin wasn't just a wrestler who held you down, he could knock you out with either hand. His professional debut came in 1996 in Brazil's veiled Tudo scene, a no-holds-barred environment where fights were often bare-knuckle and rarely went the distance. Kevin thrived, using his wrestling to control opponents and his ferocity to finish them. He quickly developed a reputation as a dangerous man to face. By 1999, the UFC came calling. Kevin entered the octagon at UFC 19, fighting Maurice Smith, a former UFC heavyweight champion known for his kickboxing. Many wondered how Randleman would handle a striker of Smith's caliber. The answer? Pure dominance. Randleman's takedowns were unstoppable, and once on top, he rained down heavy punches. That win set the tone for his UFC career. Kevin wasn't there to play safe or coast to decisions. He fought to impose his will, and most of the time, he succeeded. Within months of joining the promotion, Randleman found himself fighting for the UFC Heavyweight Championship. Kevin Randleman's UFC rise was nothing short of meteoric. After making his debut against Maurice Smith in 1999, his combination of wrestling dominance and raw athleticism made him an instant contender. Back then, the heavyweight division was still finding its identity. Strikers feared wrestlers who could take them down at will, and wrestlers feared strikers who could knock them out with a single punch. Randleman belonged firmly in the first category, but with an added edge, he wasn't afraid to throw hands. When Bas Rutten vacated the UFC Heavyweight Championship later that year, Randleman stepped into the title picture. At UFC 23 in Japan, he faced Pete Williams, a dangerous striker who had already made a name for himself with a highlight reel head kick knockout of Mark Coleman. Many expected Williams' striking to be a problem for Randleman, but Kevin turned it into a wrestling clinic. Every time Williams tried to find his range, Randleman closed the distance, took him down, and controlled him from the top. The judges awarded Kevin a unanimous decision, and with it, the UFC Heavyweight Championship. Winning the belt was validation, but defending it was the true test. His first defense came at UFC 24 against Pedro Rizzo, one of the most feared strikers in MMA at the time. The fight was razor close, with Randleman using his wrestling to neutralize Rizzo's dangerous leg kicks and power punches. Kevin won by decision, proving he could not only take a title but keep it against elite competition. But Randleman's reign wasn't built to last. In his next defense at UFC 28, he faced Randy Couture, a man whose wrestling credentials were as decorated as Kevin's, and whose experience was unmatched. The fight was a stylistic chess match, but Couture's tactical approach and superior clinch game won the day. Kevin lost his belt via TKO in the third round. Even in defeat, Randleman's stock remained high. Fans respected his willingness to fight anyone, anywhere, and promoters saw him as a guaranteed action fighter. The UFC run had cemented his reputation, but it was his next move to Japan's Pride Fighting Championships that would truly define the monster. When Randleman signed with Pride in 2002, he entered a shark tank unlike anything in the UFC at the time. Pride's heavyweight division was stacked with killers: Mirko Cro Cop Filipovic, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Fedor Emelianenko, each man a legend in the making. If UFC had been a proving ground, Pride was the ultimate gauntlet. Randleman's Pride debut came against Japanese legend Kazushi Sakuraba, a fighter known for dismantling larger opponents with slick submissions. Kevin came in bigger, stronger, and more explosive, but Sakuraba's grappling pedigree was unmatched. The fight ended in the first round with Randleman falling to a submission, a reminder that in Japan, even the smaller men could end your night. Still, Kevin was never the type to back down. He bounced back with wins over solid competition, using his wrestling to dictate pace and his power to keep opponents cautious. Then came Mirko Cro Cop, one of the most feared strikers in MMA history, known for his devastating left high kick that had ended countless careers. On paper, Kevin's wrestling gave him a path to victory, but standing with Cro Cop was considered suicidal. Randleman did it anyway. At Pride Total Elimination 2004, in a shocking twist, Kevin caught Cro Cop with a perfectly timed left hook just over a minute into the fight, knocking him out cold. The upset was seismic. Randleman had beaten one of the most dangerous men in the sport, not with wrestling, but with his fists. That knockout didn't just extend his career, it sent him into the next round of the heavyweight Grand Prix against the seemingly invincible Fedor Emelianenko. June 20th, 2004. Pride Critical Countdown. Kevin Randleman versus Fedor Emelianenko. To most, Fedor was untouchable. He hadn't lost in years, had dismantled elite strikers and grapplers alike, and was considered the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Few gave Kevin much of a chance. The fight began with Randleman doing what he did best, exploding into a takedown. But what happened next would be replayed for years. In a display of freakish strength, Kevin locked his arms around Fedor's waist, lifted him completely off the mat, and launched him backward in a picture-perfect German suplex. Fedor landed squarely on his neck and shoulders, a position that looked like it could end a career. The crowd gasped. Commentators screamed. For a brief, shocking moment, it seemed the monster had just pulled off the impossible. But Fedor was Fedor. Incredibly, he popped back up, recovered, and reversed the position. Within moments, he secured an armbar, forcing Kevin to tap. Randleman lost, but the suplex became one of the most famous moments in MMA history, a testament to his raw power and fearlessness. That single move immortalized Kevin in highlight reels and cemented his place in Pride lore. Even in defeat, he had left a mark that fans would never forget. From there, Randleman's Pride career would see ups and downs, including rematches, injuries, and more brutal wars. But that suplex, that raw display of human strength, became his calling card, the clip fans would show to anyone who wanted to understand just who the monster was. By the late 2000s, the wars in Pride had taken their toll on Kevin Randleman's body. Years of high-intensity wrestling, heavy weight cuts, and brutal fights against the best in the world left him dealing with persistent injuries. Knees, shoulders, and back all bore the scars of a career spent colliding with other elite athletes. Still, Kevin wasn't wired to step away quietly. After Pride was absorbed by the UFC in 2007, Randleman didn't immediately return to the octagon. Instead, he took fights in smaller promotions, hoping to rebuild momentum. His return to competition was rocky. Losses piled up against younger, fresher opponents. Yet even in defeat, Kevin brought an intensity that made him dangerous for as long as the fight lasted. Outside the cage, he faced even tougher battles. In 2007, a staph infection nearly killed him. What started as a minor skin irritation turned into a life-threatening condition, requiring hospitalization and multiple surgeries. At one point, doctors had to remove a portion of his pectoral muscle. Most athletes would have retired then and there. Kevin, he came back. He also had to navigate financial struggles and the harsh reality that MMA in his era didn't come with the million-dollar paydays seen by today's stars. Many of his peers, even former champions, fought well past their primes simply to make ends meet. Kevin was no different, but for him, fighting was never just a paycheck. It was his identity. Randleman's final MMA bouts came between 2008 and 2011, including appearances in Strikeforce and other regional promotions. Wins were harder to come by, but fans still turned up to see the monster make the walk, hoping for one last flash of that explosive brilliance. By the time Kevin officially stepped away from MMA, he had already begun shifting his focus to other roles in the sport. He worked as a coach, sharing his wrestling expertise with younger fighters. Kevin's training philosophy was old school: work harder than everyone else, push past the point where others quit, and carry yourself with confidence. Fighters who trained under him said his energy was infectious, his stories unforgettable. Randleman also stayed active on the appearance circuit, attending fan expos, seminars, and MMA events. His charisma made him a fan favorite, approachable, funny, and brutally honest about his career highs and lows. He was open about his mistakes, whether it was taking fights while injured, ignoring doctors' advice, or letting pride push him into risky situations. But Kevin was also a family man. He married fellow fighter and fitness model Elizabeth Broglia, and together they focused on raising their children. By all accounts, fatherhood brought out a softer side of the monster. The man who once suplexed Fedor on his head was equally happy sitting in the bleachers, watching his kids play sports. Even as his public appearances became less frequent, Kevin's legacy lived on in the fighters he inspired. Many of today's MMA athletes, from wrestlers like Daniel Cormier to showmen like Rampage Jackson, credit Randleman as a pioneer who proved that wrestling could be not only dominant, but explosive and exciting to watch. On February 11, 2016, the MMA world was shocked by devastating news. Kevin Randleman had died suddenly from complications related to pneumonia. He was just 44 years old. The announcement sent ripples through the combat sports community. Fighters, coaches, and fans from around the globe poured out tributes, sharing stories of Kevin's kindness, toughness, and larger-than-life personality. The reaction made one thing clear. While Randleman's official record may not have been spotless, his impact was immeasurable. He was remembered not just for his victories, but for the way he fought, with intensity, fearlessness, and a willingness to face anyone, anywhere, at any time. Randleman's career spanned the formative years of MMA, from the wild, unregulated days of early UFC to the global spectacle of Pride. He helped bridge the gap between pure wrestling and modern mixed martial arts, proving that grapplers could be highlight reel finishers too. And even in his losses, he created moments, like the Cro Cop knockout and the Fedor suplex, that became permanent fixtures in MMA history. Today, Kevin Randleman is celebrated as one of the sport's true pioneers. The UFC honored him posthumously by inducting him into the UFC Hall of Fame's Pioneer Wing in 2020. For fans who watched him in his prime, the monster wasn't just a nickname, it was a statement. And though he's gone, the roar of his legacy still echoes in every slam, every knockout, and every fighter who dares to walk into the cage without fear. Kevin Randleman's story was never just about wins and losses. It was about defiance, about a kid from Sandusky, Ohio, who refused to be defined by his surrounding, who took his raw talent and turned it into a weapon feared around the world. He was an NCAA champion, a UFC champion, a Pride legend, and a man who never backed down from the biggest challenges. In an era when fighters often played it safe, Randleman chased danger. He fought the best when the best were at their most dangerous. He didn't pad his record. He tested himself against Cro Cop, Couture, Fedor, and countless others, win or lose. And when the moment came to make history, he didn't hesitate. He lifted the most feared man in the sport over his head and slammed him into legend. But Kevin's legacy isn't just the highlight reel. It's in the fighters who still talk about him with awe. It's in the coaches who pass on his relentless mindset. It's in the fans who remember the monster, not just for his physique and power, but for the heart he brought every time he stepped into the cage. He left us far too soon, but the echoes of his career, the suplexes, the knockouts, the fearless walkouts, will never fade. Because Kevin Randleman was more than an athlete. He was a pioneer, a warrior, a reminder that sometimes the fight itself is the victory.